Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, I welcome you to this panel discussion on the documentary Jews of the Wild West. I'm Audrey Galex, and I serve as Community Engagement Manager at the AIB Network, where we're devoted to telling stories that help people better understand each other and ultimately live together. Well, to introduce this film, I felt I needed to give not street cred, but a little ranch cred, if you will. Back in the 1990s, my parents, Marty and Bobby Galex, were kibitzing, chatting with another couple, the Greenbergs, at a cocktail party at their clubhouse in Boca Raton. Well, as it happened, they started to talk about their children. This one's in Atlanta, that one's in New York, this one's in Miami, that one's in Detroit. And my other daughter, well, she's at a place you've never heard of, you'll never go. It's in the middle of nowhere in Texas. And of course, the Greenbergs were like, try me. Well, as it turns out, both my sister Harriet Galex and Susan Greenberg were at that time two of the only Jews living in the hill country outside of Austin, Texas, in a lovely place called Dripping Springs. And they were very, very close friends and still are. So as I watched the Jews of the Wild West, I couldn't help but think about Harriet and Susan, like the Jews of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Harriet and her husband Steve moved out of the city, though not out of a cramped tenement, for the wide open spaces. They moved for the sense of adventure. They actually bought a guy's cabin or log cabin. It had been his hunting lodge, and they moved for opportunity. Their two children, Hannah and Will, celebrated becoming a bar and bat mitzvah at a ranch near their ranch. And of course, the rabbi was in cowboy boots and cowboy hat and a bolo tie. They were not escaping anti-Semitism or pogroms, nor were they really returning to the roots of working the land, even though we were raised in Rock Island, Illinois, right on the Mississippi River, and we're always about 10 minutes from our very, very modest stables where we had our horses. Well, Dripping Springs is my happy place, and honestly, it reminds me of the Judean hills, complete with an olive grove near my sister's ranch. And with all the descriptions of the land of Israel in our sacred text, the Torah, embedded in the collective Jewish DNA, I thought, well, perhaps some of the early Jewish settlers in the Wild West might have subconsciously felt that too as they moved westward. Well, enough of my ranch cred, as I said. I am delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival to this panel discussion on the documentary Jews of the Wild West. I'm honored to be joined in this conversation by the film's director, Amanda Kinsey, Rabbi Joe Black, and Ann Kirschner. Let me introduce them. Amanda is an independent filmmaker, 5-time Emmy award-winning producer, and a 4th-generation photojournalist. And she has got some Wild West cred too, with a saloon owner, et cetera, and the like in her family tree. Prior to starting her own production company, Electric Yoke Media, in 2013, she spent more than a decade writing and winning awards for NBC. Rabbi Joseph Black is the senior rabbi of Temple Emanuel in Denver, Colorado. Temple Emanuel is the largest and oldest synagogue in the Rocky Mountains, a Reform congregation. It was founded in 1874. And prior to joining Temple Emanuel, Rabbi Black served as the rabbi of Congregation Albert. That's an interesting name, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He also serves as chaplain in the Colorado House of Representatives and is an advisor on this project. Ann Kirschner is president of Comic Communications and a university professor at City University of New York. She's the author, and I hope I pronounced this correctly, Selah's Gift and Lady at the OK Corral, which we'll reference later. She also writes about the Frozen Chosen, Jews of Alaska, and is a former senior executive of 5 startups, including NFL.com, and serves on the board of directors of several companies and nonprofits. Again, my thanks for joining us. Amanda, I would love to start with you. Easy question, I hope, but profound, I'm sure. Why did you feel compelled to direct and create this film on the Jews of the Wild West?
Sure. So I moved from New York to Denver 4 years ago with my family, and I started looking for untold stories of the Wild West. And I feel very strongly that there is an imperative for storytellers today to help amplify voices that may have been marginalized. And so I was looking for untold stories, and there is an incredible archive here at the University of Denver that is on the Rocky Mountain Jewish history specifically. So it's Colorado pretty much exclusively. And I went down to sort of check that out. And I was just blown away by the stories. I felt incredibly inspiring stories about immigration. You had interesting, Wild West characters, whether it was ranchers and, cowboys and entertainers and entrepreneurs and all the things you would expect of the Wild West. And I felt they were largely unknown in a lot of respects. And as I started to sort of do further research, I realized there were equally compelling stories throughout the West, whether it was in Texas, in New Mexico, California. And there really hadn't been a film that connected the dots of this being part of a larger migration. And I felt that that was in itself a really beautiful story to bring to a wider audience. My specialty is really trying to sort of get stories. I love stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And my background is very much of bringing stories to a kind of larger national audience. And I felt like these were very much worthy stories to be told.
Rabbi Black, or Joe, I suspect that in your congregation, you have that combination, descendants of some of these visionaries and opportunity seekers, as well as newcomers. If
Yes.
you could, how is it to minister, to have a rabbinate, if you will, to both of these communities in one large congregation?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, first of all. Amanda did an amazing job, and it was a pleasure working with her and being a very small part, but a part of this process. I've been a rabbi now. I was in Albuquerque for 14 years and now in Denver for 12. And both of those communities are growing, and you have people coming from other places. So I think you're right. In Colorado in particular, a couple decades ago, people would put bumper stickers on their cars that said native, with a Colorado, because so many outsiders are coming. Well, that's already passé, because I would say many, many people in Denver have come here from other places because it's a wonderful place to live. But as is evidenced in the film, there are some amazing stories and some amazing characters in the congregation that go back generations, people who were in the cattle business, in the chicken and egg business, the oil business. And in New Mexico, pioneers, you mentioned the name of the congregation that I served in, New Mexico congregation, Albert. I tell people it's an acronym for Ohave Limud Bracha V'Ruach HaTorah, Albert, but that's not true, but I like it. It was named after Albert Grunsfeld, who in the 1860s, they had an auction to name the temple, and the Grunsfeld family gave $250 and named it after their patriarch Albert. And while there are no Grunsfelds left in New Mexico, they still are very generous to the congregation. I think so they won't change the name. That's another story for another time. But yeah, it is a wonderful conglomeration of people from all over. But when you really start learning the history, we're about to celebrate our 150th in 2 years anniversary of Temple Emanuel in Denver. And we are doing a history project and learning stories. And, I'm so thankful for Amanda for capturing some of the more colorful and wonderful members of our community and for posterity, because that generation is going to die out. Those who did grow up on farms, who wore cowboy boots, who were pioneers, so it is really a joy to be able to have that opportunity.
And I was thinking there's no tension between the two, or maybe we're not going to.
Not anymore, really, not so much. That ship has sailed. I think you look at the Jewish community of Colorado, which is growing, but it's mostly people from other places. But the founding families and the pioneer families are very proud of their legacy, and we get along pretty well.
Now, Anne, you certainly amplified the voice of a very colorful character, the very feisty, vivacious, and I just love that expression you used in the film, a showstopper, who had that dashing husband, the famed Western lawman, Wyatt Earp, and we're talking about Josephine Marcus Earp. And I read a little bit more about her, and she was quite an intriguing character, and there were some things about her past that were maybe a little, I don't want to say troublesome, but I am wondering if how that vivaciousness, that toughness, Is that what it took to be a woman, and perhaps even in particular a Jewish woman, to survive and thrive in the Wild West?
Absolutely. Let me start by saying thanks and also congratulations to Amanda on a wonderful film that needed to be made, but that it was made with such humor and depth and just fun for the stories that it tells. And I'm delighted that Josephine is among them. Although Josephine was not particularly proud of being Jewish, she didn't absolutely hide it. But she certainly didn't proclaim it. And in all the communities that she lived in, she really never connected with the Jews around her. Wyatt actually had more Jewish friends than she did. But I think you're right. I think it took a certain grit, a certain feistiness to survive in the West, especially the way that Josephine went about it, because she ran away from home, not to join the circus, but to join an HMS Pinafore company, and ended up in Tombstone, where she met Wyatt. Josephine was very much of a free spirit, so Wyatt Earp never was her married husband. There's no evidence that she ever had a legal husband, but out in the frontier, things were kind of loosey-goosey. Common law marriage was not frowned upon. You simply declared that you were married, and then you declared that you were not married. So it was, not everyone, but Josephine was definitely a free spirit.
From what I read, to put it mildly, yes.
You want me to go into some of that?
Well, and that really speaks to a question, I guess, Amanda, for you is, did you uncover perhaps stories that were a little, like, people would share stories about their ancestors and say, I really don't want that in the film. I'm maybe not embarrassed, but it's not something I'd like to, publicize in this format.
I did not find that. And I feel like we should clarify, because people are going to wonder what we're talking about with Josephine, and Anne can talk about this a little bit more. But, there were rumors about Josephine that were not true. And I think, and Anne can explain this a little bit more, but I think part of that was the difficulty of also being a woman in the Wild West. I think that the challenges that presented.
I think we should leave that for the audience to look on their own, actually.
Okay, all right. Well, in any case, what is included in the film was what I felt was very much the truth about Josephine, and had not been debunked. And in all the, we go through, a lot of people in the film, and in all of them, there is, you could probably do a full documentary on each of them, right? So I hope that, the film really encourages people to, want to see more and want to encourage these stories being told more. And, these are, what I felt were there's sort of two narratives to the film. One is the Jewish migration, and one is the Western expansion. And what made it into the film were the intersection of where they both met, because I think that's really kind of the magic of these particular stories. And there is a huge amount of material. It's not always readily accessible. The archive at the University of Denver that I mentioned is highly unique. So I hope people, as they travel through the West, as they maybe do some more work on, looking up their own family history. I never had anyone come to me and say, oh, there was something I didn't want included in the film. But what I did run into a lot of was, people that were perhaps maybe even here in Denver that said, oh, yes, we're fifth generation Coloradans, but we don't know why we came. We don't know why we're here, or what really happened other than, maybe going back my grandparents' generation. Or sometimes I have people who will reach out and say, oh, yes, I know my family came out to Arizona, and then they eventually went back to New York, and we don't really know what they were doing in Arizona. And we thought they were the only Jews, So I think that, hopefully that this is a real validation of these wonderful, accomplished stories and people, and that people are really encouraged to see that to feel validated in the experience, and encouraged to really dig a little bit deeper themselves.
And I was delighted to learn that there's a Museum of the Western Experience, I believe, opening in California. I can't remember the name of the town, but that hopefully will further amplify the stories that you have uncovered.
I had so much fun going to some of the historical societies, like the Tucson Jewish Historical Society, when Lady at the OK Corral was first published. So there are some communities where they don't know how they got there, and then there are other communities where they're just intensely focused on maintaining that history, which was one of the things that I really got out of the film. Which was the sense of the American frontier, which is at the heart of the film, is also a peculiarly Jewish concept. There's the diaspora when you've got a gun to your head or a pogrom at the door, but then there's the sense of entrepreneurial searching for new opportunities, whether it takes you to the West or to Israel or to someplace else. That idea of being a pioneer, I think, is really deeply in the Jewish soul. And that was one of the things that really came across to me. And P.S. Josephine Marcus was not a prostitute, in my humble opinion, but that's really what we've been talking about. But just to emphasize the point, how a woman supported herself in the late 19th century was really a very short list of things that they could do to be economically self-sufficient. So thanks for pointing that out.
And interestingly, for example, in New Mexico, the Jewish community was welcomed with open arms.
Yes.
And the first mayor of Albuquerque was the first mayor of was the president of Congregation Albert, the Jaffa family. And people came for economic opportunity, but also they came for other reasons. For example, many, many families came to Denver for health reasons because they had tuberculosis or they had asthma. And so there were two, of course, not competing, one for the German Jews, one for the Eastern European Jews, consumptive aid societies that one of the things that is both a blessing and a sadness as a rabbi is I get to learn people's stories when they die. And so I hear the stories, and they're over and over again. And so many families who became extraordinarily successful initially came to the West for health reasons, because of the dry air, because of the climate. And they were welcome because this was a place where if you had something to offer, they needed it. Then, of course, anti-Semitism and things followed, but it was not. It was a good place for Jews to come because Jews were looking for places to grow and to be successful and to be healthy.
So you probably know, Joe, that Wyatt Earp stopped off in Albuquerque right after the Vendetta ride, after the gunfight at the OK Corral. And there's a wonderful story about how he exchanges his dusty clothes with, gunshots running through some of the fabric. He never was hurt, but there was lots of gunshots, and how he went to go visit Henry Jaffa. Because as I said, he had more Jewish friends than Josephine did.
Exactly. Yes.
And Rabbi Joe, you mentioned, the mayor of Albuquerque, and there were so many Jewish mayors in the Wild West. And I think you allude to that, Amanda, even in, Deadwood, South Dakota, during a pretty rough and tumble time up there. That's, again, this film, prompted me to do a little bit more research, and it's, very interesting stories you might not think about. Rabbi Joe, I do want to also ask you if, being a rabbi in the West, you have had to modify your rabbinate. Like, have you done mountain adventure bar mitzvahs, or woven in any Native American traditions, perhaps, into any of the?
I have two stories. When I first moved to Albuquerque 26 years ago, one of the very first Shabbat services in my congregation, there used to be a lot of church groups that would come and visit. And this one service, after the service, we'd have a little receiving line welcome. And this man walks up to me, a short man, and he says, Gus Chavez. And I said, well, good Shabbos. And he looked at me kind of funny, and he said, my name is Gus Chavez. Nice to meet you, Rabbi. And of course, from that moment on, every Friday night, that's how we greeted everybody, with Gus Chavez, right? And then another story, we had an annual golf tournament in our synagogue every year, and often it was at Native American pueblos. And I remember, so we were at the Sandia Pueblo Golf Course, a beautiful resort, and we're about to begin. And they said, well, let's do a blessing. And all of a sudden, a Native American medicine, I don't know what you'd call him, comes out in full regalia, beating a drum. And so I was going, no, 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 no. And then he says, let's go out and play some golf. Dun, 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 dun. Shoot for show and putt for dough. And that was it. And I'm going, and they said, okay, Rabbi, your turn. And I said, Baruch atah Adonai, hit him long and hit him high. That was what came at the top of my head. But those are just two stories from there.
Yeah. Amanda, were there any stories that, unfortunately had to hit the cutting room floor that you wish you would have been able to include?
Well, and again, I think Anne will do a great job of explaining a little bit more about the Jews of Alaska. It didn't hit the cutting room floor. I would have loved to have had the budget and the time in the film to explore Alaska a little bit more. I think that would have been a lot of fun. And, it's an interesting period because it's kind of on the tail end of the Wild West period. There's a lot more, I think, documentation than some of the earlier times. And, in Alaska, I feel like is a lot, in a lot of ways, kind of that remaining frontier. I have been lucky enough to have gone a few shoots for other projects in Alaska. And it's a fascinating place. So I would have very much have liked to have been able to kind of included that.
Anne, would you like to speak to that, the research that you did?
Oh, that was the most fun part of the research that I did. And it's hard to imagine, but Nome, Alaska was sort of the center of the universe in 1899, 1900, even into 1901, because gold had been discovered in Alaska, for decades before. But in Nome, the gold was on the beach of the Bering Sea. So you didn't have to dig for it. It was literally being washed up on the sand, So imagine your favorite beach and you're walking along and then suddenly it's covered with gold. And on the docks of Seattle and San Francisco, people were lined up for, like 15 deep to be able to get on the steamers as they were going to Alaska. So Wyatt and Josephine, who had come back from Tombstone and had wandered around in lots of the gold fields of Idaho and Colorado, they, of course, were gonna set sail for Nome, and they made several trips. And there was a Jewish community in Nome. There were Rosh Hashanah services. I saw the announcements of them in 1900. I think was the first one. So there was an active Jewish community there. But again, Josephine didn't take part in it because that wasn't that important to her. I recently discovered, and I didn't put this in my book or in the film because I didn't know it, that the original words to God Bless America, we know from the mountains to the prairies to the oceans white with foam, the original words were from the green fields of Virginia to the gold fields out in Nome. So Berlin, would have known that for everyone he was writing for when he wrote God Bless America, that Nome would have had that instant identification. But I guess over time he realized that he could lighten up a little bit on Nome. So it's a fascinating place. And I went to the Anchorage. I went to Shabbat services. I didn't say Gushavis, which I now will, Rabbi Joe. But
only in Albuquerque, only congregation.
I think that's just a great story.
True.
But I did go to Shabbat services in Anchorage. Met the rabbi of I think he's actually not only the rabbi of Anchorage, but of many other communities as well. And it's a very proud heritage. They do call themselves the Frozen Chosen, but I've also met Jews from Minnesota and North Dakota. So this is a line that I think you'll hear, in lots of places.
I was a rabbi in Minnesota, and we called ourselves the Frozen Chosen.
See.
Even in the summer.
It's if you ever get a chance. I mean, Nome, Alaska is as far north of Seattle as Seattle is west of New York, which will just give you a sense of the incredible long distances. They came back rich from Nome, not from mining gold, but what Wyatt called mining the miners. So you would find ways to make money off the miners. He ran a brothel. There was gambling going on, not to mention a lot of liquor. So thanks for giving me a chance to talk about Alaska, one of my favorite places.
Just an aside, my successor in Albuquerque started his career in Anchorage.
Wonderful.
Harry Rosenfeld. So
Great.
I'm used to the same kind of maybe frontiers mentality of the people. Amanda, were there any people who were reluctant to tell their stories, or pretty much everybody was really excited?
Well, really, I mean, I felt honored to be part of this and helping bring these stories, to a screen. I felt most people were really honored that I was asking, I mean, that was part of what I felt was the opportunity of the film, which is that a lot of these stories had not been told. I'm always of the school of thought when you first call and talk to somebody, because it's a lot of cold calling of like, I've, know that your family has this connection. When someone says, oh, I don't have a story to tell, I'm like, then I know I have the story to tell, because it's the people that don't have the publicist and haven't necessarily been all over everywhere that oftentimes have these really wonderful, authentic, beautiful stories to share. So I was really happy to be able to bring those together.
Were there any other stories, or were there any other challenges that you faced in putting the film together that you?
Well, the biggest challenge was the pandemic. And I feel like that's been the challenge for all of us, right?
Because wasn't it supposed to come out in 2020 initially?
We were scheduled to start filming most of the filming in I believe March of 2020. So both Rabbi Black and Kirschner were interviewed prior to that. They were two of like a handful of people that I had interviewed. And so the majority of it was going to be starting in March 2020. And of course, all of that couldn't happen. And then I felt very strongly that these stories really needed to come out now. There was an importance to that happening. And I shot pretty much 90% of the film from getting my vaccine in April. We left in like June 1st is when I left, and my family didn't see me for 2 months, and then we were done by August when Delta came in. So what would have usually have taken probably close to 9 months of filming, we did it in two months, which was a real marathon, and also a real leap of faith of the people we were interviewing, because we made sure everyone was tested and masked and everything, in terms of the crew, but it was also a leap of faith that people felt that they could do this, for us. And I was so appreciative of making that happen. But yeah, it's been a little bit of a marathon this summer to get that all together. But I'm so happy that we are finished with it, and so pleased that it's out now.
I have to say
Go ahead.
that so many people loved meeting with you, Amanda. I just need to hear that, is that they thanked me for making an introduction to you because they just loved you and what you were doing, and it meant a lot to them. So you need to know that.
Well,
I've heard so many.
That means a huge amount to me, and it's always my goal when I go in for any sort of interview that people feel even better about having agreed to do the interview after the interview than they did before. So I'm happy to hear that, and thank you for letting me know that.
And you mentioned that it was important to get these stories out now. Why is that? Why now?
Well, I think there's a combination of reasons. One, as Rabbi Black sort of mentioned earlier, there are a group of people who have direct memories of the Jewish pioneers, and most of them are in their 90s. So for those folks, it's generally they're either their grandparents or their great grandparents. And I felt it was very important to make sure that we got those stories captured, because they oftentimes have a lot of really wonderful detail about who these people really were in terms of their personalities and things that we wouldn't necessarily just get from a history book. So there was a sense of urgency in that sense. And I also feel that, there's obviously this incredibly awful rise in anti-Semitism. And I myself am not Jewish. And I really see my role in this film as trying to amplify these stories. There's no narrator to the film, and that's intentional. Almost everybody in the film identifies as Jewish, and that also was very important to me. And I felt that, if this film can, in its own way, help fight against some of that, that was important that this get out now. And I really, my hope is that a Jewish audience watching it feels a tremendous amount of pride in what they see, and that it's really an uplifting experience. And I hope that for a non-Jewish audience, that it's really eye-opening to the incredible contributions the Jewish community has made to the United States for a very long time. I just really think that, as I was, going through, and we're talking about all these, kind of merchants in small little towns, which was a very common, narrative for a lot of families. I think a lot of these places would have gone bust if it hadn't been for the dedication of these Jewish families. I mean, not only was it maybe the Jewish general store, but that would oftentimes the general store would become the meeting point for the town. It's where a lot of social life happened, a lot of business discussion happened. The Jewish family that ran that store was often the family that was also pushing for the first school, the first fire departments, the first libraries, all the necessities to making a successful town really came down to that. And one of the things I find so beautiful is this incredible diversity in these places, and there is a continuity to the Jewish experience for a lot of the families as well. And so I felt very strongly that these were stories that people should hear right now.
I think it's also interesting, and I found it very moving to hold a mirror up to the Jewish community itself, which sometimes, and I think this point is made early in the film, tends to think there is a Jewish experience, that it's the Lower East Side, and that's the end of it. And sadly, sometimes the spectrum of Jewish observance and experience doesn't have as much tolerance and respect for each other as we might have. And so to hold the mirror up to the diversity of the Jewish experience, and to recognize that no one slice of it has a hold on what being Jewish is all about. I think this is an important moment for that message to come across as well.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
And Rabbi Joe Black, you're on the front line of that, as you have a congregation that probably represents that whole rainbow and wash of Jewish experience. Well, we are out of time, and I am so grateful for all of you. I want to thank you on behalf of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, Amanda Kinsey and Kirschner and Rabbi Joe Black for being with us to talk about this new documentary with its North American premiere, if I'm not mistaken.
To be the worldwide premiere.
World premiere.
Yeah, I'm honored. I'm honored. This is a really important film festival for us, and I thank everybody that's been involved, and thank you, Rabbi Black and Anne, so much for getting on board early on when there was very little to go on. So thank you.
It was a joy.
Congratulations! It's a wonderful achievement.
It really is wonderful.
Thank you all very, very much. I'd like to thank those of you watching very much for joining us. Thanks.